The wind howled through the skeletal trees, carrying the scent of smoke and decay. Snow crunched underfoot as Lieutenant Henry Caldwell led his platoon through the ruined countryside, their breath visible in the freezing air. The war had turned these once thriving villages into desolate wastelands, and now they marched into the unknown, their orders clear: disable the enemy's supply line at all costs. The night was unnervingly silent, save for the distant thunder of artillery. Henry pulled his coat tighter around him, scanning the moonlit landscape for movement. They had already lost 2 men to snipers. Every step forward felt like tempting fate. "Lieutenant, movement up ahead," whispered Sergeant Tom Hayes, his voice barely audible over the wind. Henry raised his fist, signaling a halt. He crouched behind the ruins of a farmhouse, peering through the scope of his rifle. Shadows flickered in the distance, enemy patrols, moving in pairs, scanning the area. "We go around," Henry decided. "Stay low, stay quiet." The men moved carefully, weaving through the debris of a fallen world. The tension in the air was suffocating. Henry could feel it pressing against his chest, the weight of responsibility growing heavier with each passing hour. A sudden gunshot shattered the silence. "Ambush!" someone shouted, but the enemy was already upon them. Bullets tore through the cold night, kicking up snow and dirt. Henry dove behind cover, his heart hammering in his chest. He returned fire, dropping a soldier who had broken from the trees. His men fought desperately, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The enemy had the advantage, but Henry refused to let fear consume him. "Hold your ground," he shouted, rallying his men. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity. One by one, the enemy fell, but at a cost. Corporal Mason lay motionless, his blood staining the snow. Private Dawson clutched his arm, trying to stifle the bleeding. When the last shot was fired, Henry exhaled shakily. They had survived, but barely. "We can't stay here," Hayes murmured, his face grim. "Reinforcements will come." Henry nodded. "We keep moving. We have to complete the mission." Dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and gray. The platoon trudged forward, their energy waning. Their target, a railway bridge vital to the enemy's supply chain, was only miles away. They reached a ridge overlooking the valley where the bridge stood, heavily guarded. Henry studied the defenses, his mind racing. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and exhausted. "We need a distraction," he murmured. Hayes hesitated. "We don't have the manpower to fight head-on." Henry's jaw tightened. "Then we use what we have." A plan formed. A small team, led by Hayes, would draw the guards away with explosives, while Henry and the others would plant charges beneath the bridge. It was risky, but there was no other choice. As darkness fell, they moved into position. The first explosion rocked the valley, and shouts erupted as soldiers scrambled toward the commotion. Henry and his team sprinted toward the bridge, planting the charges with practiced precision. Then gunfire. The distraction team was engaged in a firefight. Henry's hands trembled as he set the detonator. "Fall back," he yelled, his men retreating as the ground quaked beneath them. A deafening explosion split the air. The bridge crumbled, taking the enemy's supply route with it. Henry watched as the structure collapsed into the icy river below, victory tinged with exhaustion. They had succeeded. But as Henry counted his remaining men, he realized the cost had been far too great. The war was not over. Not for them. And as they disappeared into the winter night, Henry knew that the shadows of the battlefield would haunt them forever. They had barely put distance between themselves and the demolished bridge when a sudden flare illuminated the sky. The enemy was already on their trail. Henry clenched his jaw, motioning for his men to move faster through the thick snow. "They're coming," Dawson panted, limping as he struggled to keep pace. Hayes grabbed Dawson's arm and threw it over his shoulder. "We're not leaving anyone behind." Shots rang out behind them. Henry turned, raising his rifle. The enemy was advancing, a pack of soldiers determined to avenge the destruction of the bridge. Henry fired, taking down the first soldier. The others followed suit, unleashing a barrage of bullets into the darkness. "Move, move," Henry barked, covering their retreat. They dived into the forest, using the thick trees as cover. Hours passed as they evaded their pursuers. Exhaustion gnawed at their bodies, but stopping meant death. As dawn broke, they found a small, abandoned barn nestled in the valley. It offered little protection, but it was shelter. Henry collapsed against the wooden beams, his breath heavy. The remaining men gathered inside, their faces drawn with fatigue. "We can't stay here long," Hayes muttered. "We need to keep moving west." Henry nodded. "We'll rest for an hour. Then we move." But fate had other plans. The sound of engines rumbled in the distance. Henry's heart sank as he peeked through a crack in the barn wall. Enemy trucks rolled into the valley, soldiers fanning out. "They found us," he whispered. His mind raced. They were trapped, outnumbered, low on ammunition. This wasn't a battle they could win. Then an idea struck. "We set an ambush," he said, turning to his men. "We don't have to defeat them. We just need to delay them." They positioned themselves strategically, using the terrain to their advantage. When the first soldiers stepped too close, Henry fired the first shot. Chaos erupted. Grenades exploded. Bullets ripped through the morning air. The enemy scrambled for cover, but Henry's men fought with the desperation of those who had nothing left to lose. The battle raged on until the enemy finally fell back. Henry's hands were slick with sweat and blood as he reloaded his weapon, his breath ragged. But the respite was short-lived. More reinforcements were coming. They needed to escape. With no time to waste, they slipped away into the forest once more, battered but alive. As they marched onward, Henry cast one last look at the battlefield behind them. The war was far from over, but in that moment, he knew one thing. He would keep fighting, no matter the cost. Because in the shadows of the battlefield, survival was the only victory left.